Sunday, and I'm going to let you in on a little secret. We aren't using the official Reformation text this morning. Since it's a festival day, we get to pick. We can either follow the lectionary, or we can read from the special assigned Reformation texts. The gospel assigned for today was a reading from John, which was Martin Luther's favorite gospel, which is why they picked a reading from John. And in this John reading, there are these lovely verses, which mostly sing of freedom and grace. And they say, if the Son makes you free, then you will be free indeed. Free to receive mercy, free to receive grace, free to be one of God's imperfect, perfect children. But we're not reading those verses. Because Zacchaeus, the man that we read about, he embodies this very freedom that John writes about. Zacchaeus is an imperfect, perfect child of God. He just didn't know it yet, at least not at first. And neither did Martin Luther. Luther thought that nothing he did could ever make him worthy in God's eyes. He prayed 3 hours a day. He fasted, he studied. You name the special church thing that you were supposed to do, and Luther did it. He was an insanely curious, half afraid of God kind of person. And still, he struggled with God's graciousness. And this was the same with Zacchaeus. I mean, really, Zacchaeus wasn't quite as proper, not nearly close to being as proper as Martin Luther was, but he certainly had the insanely curious, half-afraid of God piece down. Zacchaeus, he does climb up the tree because he's short, but I don't think it's just because he was short. What he really wanted was to catch a glimpse of this man called Jesus. But I'm not so sure that he really wanted Jesus to know that he was drawn to him. So he climbs up in this tree and he kind of hides out there. He can see Jesus, but presumably Jesus wouldn't be able to see him. I think he was using the tree as a hideout, just as much as a lookout. And I was just reading this article about social media forums, and they have a term for people like Zacchaeus. And I read this and I thought, that is Zacchaeus. They're called lurkers. And these are people who enter chat rooms or Facebook or whatever, any of these things, but they never participate in the discussion. So Zacchaeus is kind of like an ancient lurker. And I think that there are actually a lot of lurkers around, and they're not just out there somewhere. I'd say that many of us are lurkers, drawn to Jesus, drawn to the promise of healing and wholeness that Jesus proclaims. And yet, at the same time, not quite sure about this Jesus. And I don't know why that is. I mean, many of us carry around shame from past mistakes, or we've been shunned just enough or looked down upon just enough that it doesn't really seem quite worth the risk to trust in this grace. I would say we all have our trees, our places that we hide out. Grace and mercy are really hard things to believe in when we live in a world of ungrace. I mean, grace is, I asked the kids to define grace. Grace and mercy are these churchy words that we kind of throw around. But to really nail it down, I think, is hard. I mean, the definition that they would have told me in seminary would be, grace is receiving more than you could ever possibly ask for. And mercy, they would have said, is not receiving what you deserve. And Zacchaeus, he lived in the same type of culture of ungrace. And he also participated in the culture of ungrace. So if he lived in a world like that and he participated in a world like that, kind of like we do, why would he expect anything different from Jesus? And I'm totally all about grace. I love the concept of it. If there's anything that I think the church can do more of, is proclaim grace. But it's also the thing that the church has struggled with so much. Luther struggled with allowing God's grace to meet him. Zacchaeus hid from Jesus. We lurk in shadows. If grace is this extravagant gift of God to us, why is it that we seem to struggle with it or hide from it? What's so hard about grace? Well, I have to tell you that I know, and probably you all can point to your own times, what's so hard about grace. I know that it's hard for me if I receive an email that kind of stings me. I know that I have to swallow extra hard to act graceful. I know that if I feel like my feelings have been hurt or wrong, that the mama bear in me immediately wants to come out, and I don't want to be so graceful. And I know it's hard to trust or proclaim grace when people that you love are lying in hospital beds. I can scream just as loudly as the next person that it's not fair. Or that, God could fix it if God really wanted to. Grace is really hard to live out. Which may be why it's actually so hard for us to trust it. It's hard for us to believe that Jesus' feelings towards us are any different than our own. But they are. And if there's one thing I could proclaim over and every single day I could stand up here and say is that God loves us beyond our ability to feel lovable. And I believe that God even loves us beyond our ability to sin. That we could sin and sin and sin, and there's no end to what God could forgive. Because in the end, that is really what makes all the difference. And I would say to anyone who lives and breathes in this culture of ungrace, to not let anyone ever tell you you are anything but a loved child of God. Because that's what Jesus says there at the end. That this is indeed a son of Abraham. That no matter who you are loved and chosen and wrapped in this unending grace of God. Which is why Zacchaeus' real life experience with grace is so delightfully intoxicating, so much about what the Reformation actually is. He leaped out of the tree without even having to think twice about it. And that grace, it grabbed Luther so tightly that it began the biggest upheaval in church history. And I think that grace may be really hard to intellectually get. But I think when we brush up against it a little bit and can take in how grace actually feels, that's a whole different thing. Because if somebody asked me how grace feels, I would say grace feels like the first time I held a newborn baby. And I would say grace feels like the first time I laughed after someone died. And I would say grace smells like chocolate chip cookies straight out of the oven. And I would say grace is like whispered words of I love you and I'm sorry, all rolled up into one. That's what I would say grace feels like. Because that type of grace, the grace that we know in Jesus, that type of grace changes hearts. That starts reformations. And what happened that day with Zacchaeus was more than he just went to his house to stay. Jesus actually went to Zacchaeus' heart to stay. And he left this residue of holiness there in Zacchaeus' heart. Because it is Jesus who sees us even when we hide from him. And he sees us through loving eyes, if there's anything Luther wanted us to know, and Jesus wanted us to know, is that God sees us through loving eyes. We're all going to mess up. And we're all going to get things right sometimes. But as God's imperfect, perfect children, we are free to live in this blissfully unexpected gift from God, grace.